how is your podcast going to fit into your current marketing strategy? Where people think, "Ooh, I don't have time to start a podcast right now," is because they're seeing the podcast as something else to do, as opposed to not only is it top of funnel, but it's also your content engine. So that's one thing for our listeners to think about. It's not an add-on, it's a replacement. And I truly believe that with the right system, your podcast can cut your marketing time in half.
Hey friend, and welcome to the Feel Good Social Podcast. I'm your host, Kinsey, and I'm here to help you market your business in a genuine way that works without wasting your precious time. So sit back, relax, and enjoy some genuine conversation for the good of your biz. Hey, my Feel Good friends, and welcome to the Feel Good Social Podcast. I'm your host, Kinsey, and today we are chatting with a podcast launch strategist and growth expert. Her name is Rosemarie, and she is just ditching up so many great tips for making sure that you're honing the strategy behind your podcast for your business. We geek out about lots of different things. And at the end, I dish up a few of my recent insights when it comes to video podcasting. So if you do enjoy this show, make sure that you share it with another business friend who could also use to listen to it. And why not leave us 5 stars or a friendly review on whatever podcast platform you're listening to us on, because it really does help us to continue spreading our feel good message and growing our feel good community. All right, let's go ahead and dive right in. Hi, Rosemarie. Thank you so much for coming on the Feel Good Social Podcast. I'm so excited to bring you on the show, lady.
No, I'm really excited to be here to talk to you and to your audience about all things podcasting.
Yes. Before we dive into our conversation, I did already introduce you just a little bit in the intro, but I'd love to hear from you. Who are you? What do you do? Who do you serve?
Yeah, so I'm Rosemarie Callender. I work primarily with women coaches and service providers, helping them to launch and grow podcasts that are marketing and sales assets for their business.
Yes, I love your approach to that, because I think it is so important to really think about that, especially when you're creating a podcast for your business.
Yes.
So this is going to be an awesome topic. But I do like to just kick off the conversations by asking, how did you get started doing what you do? What has your journey looked like?
Yeah, so I'll be celebrating 4 years this September 2024. But it all started out as a virtual assistant. So my corporate background is as an executive assistant at C-suite level over here in the UK. I'm based near London. And then COVID happened, that old thing. And I started my business in the summer. So maybe 4 months into COVID, as just like a backup plan, just in case I lost my job, which turned out I did. By the end of the year, I was made redundant. And so I started off as a virtual assistant because from EA to VA seems like a very simple transition. However, it is very different to have someone, the person you support, sitting 2 feet away from you versus someone who I had a client once that was in New Zealand, completely different time zone from me. So that was rather challenging. But then once I got noticed that I was losing my job, I really started to think about what could I do that lit me up a bit more, where I felt like I was making an impact. You know, there's certain buzzwords in the online space that I was hearing, but also the VA work wasn't fulfilling. It was also exhausting. Yes, I was starting up my business alongside my 9 to 5, but the work that I was doing was very short. So I could spend 30 minutes scheduling social media posts, 30 minutes proofreading and scheduling an email. It was very bitty, and it took me a while to realize that's not how the brain likes to function, or at least not my brain. I like to focus on one thing for a solid 2 hours, 3 hours at a time, rather than jump between tasks. I found that really exhausting. So at that time, one of my VA clients was launching a book in the spring of 2021, and she was guesting on lots of podcasts, and that's how I fell down the podcast rabbit hole. I was doing a lot of repurposing of those episodes for her, pulling out quotes for social media. And then I kind of went down the well, like, what? And so I went down the rabbit hole, bought a podcast manager course, completed it over the Christmas, and not completely pivoted, but added podcast management services to my offer suite. And then over the next 4 or 5 months, started to phase out the VA services. And then over the years, I've gone from podcast manager to podcast strategist to now podcast launch strategist and growth coach. So I've been consistent, more or less, in the podcasting space because I absolutely love it.
Yes. Oh, I love that so much. We were chatting again before we hit record, and I definitely am a proponent of podcasts as a form of content. It's just one of those awesome platforms that it's not really that overcrowded as far as like Instagram or websites or whatever it is. Also, I love that people hit play on a podcast and they're expecting to spend time with you. Yeah. It just feels so intimate, so much more than any other type of content, at least for me. So I can't wait to nerd out about this with you. And honestly, like, I'm one of those people, I will admit it, where I'm like, anyone tells me any business idea or anything, I'm like, oh, you should start a podcast. Oh, you should think about it. And they're like, Kinsey, like, but come on, it's great.
Marketing tool for most businesses.
Let's talk a little bit about then podcast strategy and who should start a podcast and what should they think about when starting a podcast, especially incorporating it with your business.
Yes, I know there'll be at least one person listening to this conversation right now thinking, yes, tell me all about the tech. I know that is the one piece when it comes to starting a podcast that really holds people back. But I promise you, it's not that complicated. And the most important piece is that once you set it up for launch, that really is it. So we're not going to dive too much into that because I think the piece that a lot of business owners miss and then try to catch up on later on down the road is this strategy piece. So as you mentioned, Kinsey, it's thinking about how is your podcast going to fit into your current marketing strategy. And a piece of that where people think, oh, I don't have time to start a podcast right now is because they're seeing the podcast as something else to do, as opposed to seeing the podcast as not only is it top of funnel, which we'll come into later, but it's also your content engine. So you record that 20, 30, 40 minute podcast episode. And from that, you pull all your content, whether that's from Instagram, your Facebook group, Pinterest, LinkedIn, or like all the places. You literally can pull so many gems, so many key information that really solidifies your expertise and builds your authority across multiple platforms from a really short 20, 25 minute episode. So that's one thing that for our listeners to really think about. It's not an add-on, it's a replacement. And I truly believe that with the right system, your podcast can cut your marketing time in half. You can't just be like here, there, everywhere. You need to have it streamlined and working for you and having those processes in place. So that's where I usually recommend you start. Like, how is this podcast going to serve my business? And for the clients that I work with, the top 2 goals are lead generation, or what I like to call client acquisition. And then the second one is collaborations, visibility opportunities. It's usually more speaking. They would love to be able to, they've got big dreams of being paid to speak, or even just having the opportunity to be approached to speak by some people who they really admire in the online space because they've got a podcast that allows them to show up. It's such an intimate platform. They're able to show up and showcase their expertise in a wildly different way from any other marketing platform. It allows them to put their best foot forward and for those invitations to come through. What is it for you? Some people want to use their podcast platform to interview other leaders so that they can build their network. There's nothing wrong with that, but you just need to get very clear around what that purpose is for you. What are those goals for you? And then really thinking about like, why do you want to start a podcast? This is slightly separate from the goal. So for me personally, I have a podcast. It's been about 3 years now. Time flies, I'm telling you. But it's been about 3 years now. And yes, my own goals for my podcast are client acquisition and speaking. But my why is very closely linked with my mission. And that is all around, women, I believe any woman, but business owners specifically, is such an intimate, powerful platform for us to market and sell our offers without having to be constantly on. I don't know if this statement is still being repeated, but I remember when I first started out in the online space, I heard someone talk about you should be marketing 80% of the time. And I was like, when am I supposed to do what? When am I supposed to do anything else? So you're trying to tell me in 20% of the time, I'm supposed to serve my existing clients, and we wear many hats, right? Especially as solopreneurs. But that statement has always blown my mind. And that's why I lean so heavily on my podcast, because it's evergreen content, is always out there. And I can cut that down by at least 30-40%. Let me focus on getting the podcast in front of the right people, really perfecting my episode titles so that they feel like, ooh, this is for me. And then my content will do the rest. 80%, right? Even now, that blows my mind. But yeah, so getting very clear around your why and your goals, and also thinking about when is the best time to launch. Budget is a huge piece of it as well. Can you outsource? What can you outsource? Because I think a lot of people focus on the launch itself and not necessarily what comes after the launch, which is why there's quite an incredible stat. Last time I checked, it was around 78% of podcasts don't make it past episode 7, episode 10, which is really scary to think of. And because I've worked with some clients in my earlier days, which is why I can speak to this now, it's very much because they didn't have a plan before the launch. So just being really clear with yourself. When it's best to launch? Do I need to do seasons? Can I hire a team? Like all the things before you throw yourself into it. And then the biggest piece, which is probably where I should have started, is who is your podcast for? So if you're podcasting for business, i.e. client acquisition, speaking opportunities, building your network, but definitely if you want to use it as a client acquisition tool, your ideal listener is usually your ideal client. So being really clear as to who your who is, so that you can create content that's relevant and relatable to them. And if you take nothing else away from this episode, although I'm sure you will take away many gems, not being afraid to really dial in on your who. So you don't need to niche, that dreaded word. You don't need to niche like 5 levels. A business coach for moms, if you were to say a business coach for moms of under 5s or toddlers, that's a bit more specific, and you can speak very clearly to that mom's pain points, because that mom's pain points is going to be different to a mom who has teenagers. So just being really clear about who you're speaking to, niching down one level, because it will make content creation and conversion so much easier. So those are the 4 or maybe 5 points that I would start with when you're thinking about getting started with launching your podcast.
Yeah. Oh, man. So much to unpack there. I love it. I can just speak from personal experience. The Feel Good Social podcast is 4.5 years in. And then we have our new podcast, Authentic AI. We're hitting the 1-year mark for that one, which is so exciting. And yeah, I've heard that stat as well, where I think the majority of podcasts don't make it past the 10 episode mark, which is so sad because I understand that it does feel heavy. I think also just adjusting your expectations as far as how much work it will actually take to put episodes out, and then also the return on investment. But I can truly attest to the fact that I have people coming to me who listen to Feel Good Social podcast episodes from years ago. I had someone just recently buy one of my new online courses because she listened to an episode about one of my older online courses. It's just so funny. And this content does really last. And it is such a good idea to come at it with a strategy. And I love that you brought up the ideal listener thing too. And you said this, another thing that people really need to think about is not just like the person, who am I speaking to, but where are they at in the journey?
1,000%.
And how is the podcast content that I'm creating going to allow them to continue on their journey with me to then become hopefully a client or customer or something like that.
There's so many different nuggets. That was like overview. But like in my podcast strategy sessions, there's so much other stuff that we cover. I've got a 6-phase framework called Impact. But yeah, so at the top level, I think that the main thing that I want to get across is not to be scared of niching, because I feel as though there are a lot of people who've had a podcast, starting a podcast on their heart for normally years. It's not usually something that they wake up, oh, I'm going to start a podcast today. Normally it's something that they've wanted to do for years. They've bought the microphone, they've made their dream guest list, they have thought of the name, and then they get started and it's so much more and it's overwhelming and they get into the stuff. And then the biggest piece is, I want to help everyone. I started my podcast like that. I wanted to help every woman start a podcast. And so my podcast was not aligned. Yes, it was about podcasting, but I was doing podcast management in my business at that time. And my first season is about podcast launching. I didn't talk about my offers. As you can tell, there's no direct correlation. My episodes are very step 1, step 2. They had it all. They could just listen and go do. And yes, whilst our podcasts are to educate, we don't want to educate people in that way. We don't want to just give them everything. We want to be able to shift their beliefs and educate them on the problem that they're having. But yes, that was the biggest piece that I wanted to get across. It's okay. In fact, I recommend that you create a show that's for your person and not everyone on the planet. When you niche, it's a good thing. I promise you.
Yeah. Okay. So one thing I did want to ask you, because my antenna went up, is you did say that podcasting can actually cut your content creation time in half or whatever you said. But I was like, oh, hello. I know that is definitely a big thing for a lot of people just when it comes to content creation. Like, I'm constantly creating. And guys, I feel that too myself. And I will say this probably plays into it. One of the things I always remind people of, and I keep needing to tell myself this because I get caught up in the freaking Instagram, shiny object syndrome and stuff, but I need to constantly keep reminding myself that my podcast content is actually way more valuable for my business and worth my time than Instagram content and stuff like that. And the fact that you are saying you have a system for making it faster and quicker. Can you tell us a little bit more about your system for that?
I don't know if it's necessarily my system, but it's really simple in terms of, first of all, it starts with planning the episode. It works for some people, but the winging, especially of solo episodes. What am I going to talk about today? Set the mic. That works really well for a very small percentage of people who've really honed talent. But for most of us, it doesn't land and it doesn't glean the results that we want. And for most of my clients, they're very much prepping the episode. A broad episode title, some key talking points, client examples, and then you record it. Some people script, some people use bullet points, totally up to you, whatever you feel best, especially when you're starting out. But you use that to create your episode, making sure you stay on point. You record the episode and then you transcribe it. You can use tools like otter.ai or we're using Squadcast to record, which is linked with Descript, which is really a beautiful tool for all things audio, even video editing as well. But your transcript is then where everything comes from. So you can go through it and pull, if you've got 2 or 3 talking points, those 3 talking points could be a carousel on Instagram, right? Turn the entire transcript into a blog post, SEO optimize it for Google, for your website. You can pull quotes and stick it on a graphics, a Canva template, and put it on Instagram stories or copy and paste to threads. You can create an email newsletter and the 3 key points are the bullet points. There's so much. I worked with someone once who turned her transcript into a LinkedIn article. So there are people who prefer to read. So you won't necessarily see those numbers as listeners, but you're getting that traction on LinkedIn, which is a very beautiful thing. If you understand that platform, I do not. But if you're on LinkedIn, then that can work really well. And what I love about this strategy is it's multi-channel, but it just feels easier. I do my marketing Mondays and I create content for the week, but it's almost like you're creating different content depending on the platform, which can then make you feel a little bit scattered. your content isn't cohesive. Whereas if it's all coming from one podcast episode, and maybe that's your theme for the week, it feels more cohesive. You're already cementing your expertise on that topic, but you're not necessarily posting the exact same thing across platforms. I don't know if you're like me, where you're on someone's list and you get the exact same email that you then see on their threads, that you then see on their Instagram, and you're like, I need to unfollow you in one of these places because I don't want to see the word for word. Whereas if you repurpose a podcast episode, you will be sharing different, yes, there will be some themes that are interwoven, but it's not going to be the exact same piece of content. So yeah, it all starts with your episode transcript.
Yes, I love this so much. And I need to take your advice a little bit more too. It is so funny. I've actually, I just love showing up every week for my podcast, but also at the same time, I feel like I'm somewhat leaving some content, repurposing stuff on the table almost because it all just comes so quickly. I do want to ask you just a little bit about video podcasting because it is one of those things. Let me just tell you, lady, I've been podcasting for like 4.5 years now. I have gone to a few different podcast conferences, which is just a whole nother thing.
That's another episode.
Oh, yeah. But one thing I will say is that at all of these podcast conferences, I kept getting so annoyed because everyone was like, video.
Yeah.
I just could not do video. I didn't feel comfortable showing up on video. And especially for solo shows, I'm so awkward trying to, record myself on video and like worry. It didn't feel as authentic and stuff. However, I recently, since really deep diving into Descript, have started especially sharing my video episodes for interviews and stuff, just because it's so much easier to be natural and whatnot. But what are your thoughts on video podcasts? Because I know some people are like, you have to do it. And then some people are like, I don't know. It doesn't really matter. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, this is an individual question. I'm a bit like you. I like podcasting because I can do it in my headscarf, in my PJs. I don't really have to get dressed. And also like you, yes, I will record video. I use Riverside. I will do the video component for interviews, but my solos, I'll use Audacity, which is a recording and editing platform. This is very much a personal question. Do you have the capacity? Because video, I am not a YouTube expert, but from what I understand, video watchers are a lot more, I feel like they're different. So video watchers and podcast listeners are different. It's usually not the case that you'll post a video on YouTube and they'll travel over to listen to your podcast. When they want to watch a video, they want to watch a video, right? And I just feel as though adding video brings another level of work. I used to do video editing and it just takes, I feel like it's a lot more intricate. You need to put in you can't just cut because then people are going to not watch your videos. They need transitions. And I mean, I haven't got time. I'm a solopreneur. I haven't got the time. And so this is a very personal question to you. When's the best time for you to launch? Do you have the budget to outsource? If you've got the budget to outsource and you want to hand it all over to a team, go full. You can just record your video, pass it on to someone else, and they'll do it all for you. And it just magically happens, which is a beautiful place to be. But if you're like me and most of my clients who are solopreneurs, yes, they hire contractors, but they don't have this huge team, you might just want to start out audio. And you could still record the video like you and I are, Kinsey, but you just don't put it out. I've got all my guest interviews recorded, and maybe at some point I might stick them on. Maybe. I mean, I've been podcasting 3 years. I've never felt the desire to do so. But that's really a personal question. What I will say is that, to your point, don't feel like you have to. I am on Threads, and yes, there are some people who do what I do and I counted one person once a few weeks ago. His number one, do video. I'm like, no. No. He was also like, post on social media. I was like, no. Like, this is why people think it's a lot of work, because you are telling people they have to do these things when really most people don't have the capacity. They're already burnt out by social media. And here you are telling them, well, you have to post your stuff on social media. I don't post my podcast episodes on social media anymore. because I wasn't seeing the traction. So I'd rather focus on other things like podcast SEO or collaborations like we are, or engaging with my current listeners. There's so many other ways rather than you must post on social media. My answer would be it's a personal question you ask yourself and remove the pressure. Whenever it feels right to you to add video, do it, but don't feel like, oh my goodness, I'm going to lose out. Because at the moment, YouTube stats don't even transfer over. So you'll be monitoring 2 different stats from 2 different platforms, which me even saying those words just makes me feel exhausted. I've got this many listeners, this many downloads. Oh, that episode is doing really well. I don't want to be scattered into multiple different places. That defeats the object of streamlining my marketing. But yes, if you want to start at audio and then when you get to a certain point where you can add video, you can do that as well.
Oh, I love that take because that's exactly how I always felt too. I'm just like, no, don't tell me that I have to do all of this extra work. Yeah. And I'm still seeing results. I'm still putting myself out there. I am just so glad that I got started and that I have continued going through the years. And for 4 years, I have been putting out audio only stuff.
And you survived.
I will. Yeah. And I survived. And I saw a lot of traction and ROI from that. I will just speak to the video stuff just because I've only recently started doing that. It took me for freaking ever because of exactly what you just said. And then working with Descript, I started integrating Descript into my editing workflow, especially because of its new like clip creation, easy automated video clip creation. And I love using that to then just share with my guests, even to give them the gift of content. And so I'm like, okay, well, I'm already pretty much editing this video in Descript. One simple 10-second intro clip, one simple 10-second outro clip. I stick those on either end of the video. I throw it into YouTube. I really don't even care that much.
Okay.
I don't do that much. And actually, I do edit because with Descript, I've finally finagled it so that it's pretty much editing the audio for myself.
That is,
and I don't worry about the video as much.
Figured that out.
And and actually, I will say too, at the time that this episode will come out, I actually just finished literally like yesterday this Descript editing training that I'm doing for an online summit. Yes. I'll be sharing with that too. But yeah, I literally don't do much, and then I throw it into YouTube, and from there, I just don't even really care about the YouTube. But I actually have gotten an inquiry from a YouTube watcher randomly, just like within the last 3 weeks. And like, okay, we're doing this now. But
no, YouTube's great for visibility. It's a search engine. But yes, to your point, I don't want people listening thinking they should wait because they need to add video. You've waited long enough. If you're like any of the clients that I work with, you've waited long enough to get started. You don't need to add video. And I'm a firm believer that new podcast hosts should just settle into this new role as a host for your first 6 months. I've worked with clients before who I offer podcast launch VIP days, and between the VIP day and their launch date, which could be a week or 2, they've already asked me, how do I grow? How do I grow my podcast? How do I get more listeners? And I'm like, dude, can we just launch? Can you just find your system, find your routine, get your flow, nail down your workflow, like you said, Kinsey, this is why people get overwhelmed, and this is why they're pod fade and why they don't get past episode 10, because they're trying to Usain Bolt it down the online road before they can even take a step. And yes, YouTube has great visibility opportunities, but I just think, look at your own capacity. I see YouTube like Pinterest. So when you're ready to really get more eyes on your show, YouTube, Pinterest, guesting on for me, they're all in the same bubble, except guesting is less work, right? You just show up, have a great conversation for an hour, and Bob's your uncle, you're done. You just promote it when the episode goes live. But yes, I mean, 3 weeks, an inquiry is amazing. And I've definitely heard of similar stories, but to get to that point, I just feel like you have to learn YouTube SEO. It is a new platform. It isn't like most marketing platforms. What works on Instagram doesn't work on Threads. What works on Threads doesn't work on LinkedIn. So it's seeing it in that way. Do I have the capacity to learn not just the doings, the things you've got to do, but to learn two different platforms as well.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
And for sure. I mean, guys, it took me 4.5 years to finally start. And I will say too that even myself, I have taken breaks in the past year in both of my podcasts because I was getting in my head about the video stuff.
Yeah.
I was hearing those little faceless voices in my head being like, but the video, you have to do video. I just wasn't getting it done and wasn't getting it edited. I finally made that shift of I'm just going to put stuff out there. Who the heck cares about the video? Only recently with the Descript stuff. And I think also what's helped me with this video editing stuff is really understanding my own priorities when it comes to editing in the podcast, right? So I don't really care that much about editing the video, and I'm still just editing with the audio priority, the audio quality priority, and just like throwing it out there because that's what I need to do now, right? So yeah, we're figuring it out, but just realize that there's so many ways to do the things and figuring out what's going to work for you, right?
That's the important piece, doing what feels good and what works for you. Yeah, 100%.
Well, I love that so much. Thank you so much for sharing your awesome knowledge with us. Can you please share about any resources that you have and where people can find you and connect with you?
Yeah, so I hang out mostly on my podcast, the Podcast Amplify show. Tune in to learn more podcast tips, strategies, how you can create a podcast that is a marketing and sales asset for your business rather than just this thing that you're showing up for every week and you're like, questioning, why am I doing this? Like, we don't want that. We want this platform to work for you. And then in terms of personal connection, you can drop me a DM on Instagram at Too Busy to Podcast. And I hang out mostly on Threads, dropping random inner thoughts but also some very helpful podcasting tips as well.
Yes, I love it. And we'll link everything in the show notes below. And thank you so much again.
Thanks, Kinsey.
How great was Rosemarie, you guys? I love the actionable insights and tips that she dished up for us. And oh my gosh, her spunky personality and realness when it comes to making things work for you in your business. Such a great conversation. And if you loved it as much as I did, make sure that you share it with another business friend who could also use to listen to it. And why not share it to your Instagram stories? Make sure that you tag me. I'm at Feel Good Social because then I'll be able to see it, reshare it, and give you a follow and keep cheering you on over there. All right. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week, and I'll catch you next time I catch you. Thanks so much for listening, my friend. For show notes and a whole lot of other awesome freebies, visit feelgoodsocial.com. Simply go to feelgoodsocial.com for all the goods.